Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating what I think are the necessary building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. And today's topic will circle around soul-centric spirituality. And why is this very important for the great transition we are all in? Because I really think however we perceive of spirituality, whether we call it a line of development that we can nurture and grow, or it's a certain peak experience, one of these rare moments where we truly feel connected with everything, with nature, maybe God or the universe or universal life force running through it. I really think rediscovering ourselves as human beings in this crucial phase of humanity, becoming shepherds for all the other sentient species on this planet. I really think working with spirituality and developing ourselves as human beings is just, super important. I'm feeling very grateful today, connected, from a very different side of the planet. So we're having this virtual room together, me and Samantha Sweetwater from Berlin to the west coast of the United States. And like always in my podcast, I do not want to live the human being, making this human experience on the other side of the planet, outside of the door. So I would like to explore your biography. What made you the human being that you are, and ultimately what led you to that purpose that you're living? Samantha, super curious on that whole dialogue, and I'm really curious to hear some of the pivotal moments of your biography.
I loved receiving your questions. It's so good to be here, Alistair. It's a delight to be able to speak across the planet and to people who are interested in these things. Shall I share a bit about where I come from in my upbringing? I was the child of hippies. I think that is a defining factor of who I am. I was the child of two people who really, at the time that they had me, though they did not continue to be these people, at the time that they had me, they really wanted connection to the earth. And I was a little baby in rivers and in a pretty communal context where I had a lot of other adults around me who loved me. And my parents were the youngest parents in their friend group. And so I was sort of like, I had a lot of aunties and uncles. It's interesting. I think that my mother has always said that I raised myself. And I think the defining aspect of my childhood was voracious curiosity, that I was nurtured through art and science. And I was very lucky to receive a lot of help and support from my parents and other adults around me to kind of be nurtured with those two muses. And in a way, I think the depth of a rigorous mystical perspective is always nurtured by art and science, by like the capacity for deep aesthetic sensing and the capacity for deep and rigorous objective sensing. And those, in a lot of ways, that defined my childhood. The other thing that defined my childhood is I grew up in Philadelphia in a school that was 90% African American, and in homes that in a neighborhood that was all row houses and twin houses. And so I grew up not at all identified with whiteness, very, very well conscious of my whiteness and also conscious of racism, and very not okay with it. Like I was a social justice warrior from very young, and I was very clear that I wasn't going to play into racial divides that were being projected into my school, into social spaces in my school and social spaces outside of school. And that was a big part of how I understood myself from a very young age, and grew up like running around these row houses and these twin houses in a place where everybody's parents were parents to everybody. And then at 10, I think I became a systems thinker at 10, because we moved from Philadelphia, from this old brownstone neighborhood in Philadelphia, to Cupertino, California, where Silicon Valley was being built. All the apricot orchards were being raised, and tract houses and malls and all the businesses, Apple, HP, they were all being built right then. And all the houses were suburban houses with garage door openers. So I went from like an open door, multi-yard, multi-parent world to a latchkey garage door fenced world. And it was incredibly obvious to me, like the architecture, how architecture shapes consciousness and shapes relationships, was slammed in my face in a way that was really obvious to me. And everything changed. And I went from a very multi-ethnic, fairly well integrated, not perfectly integrated, but relatively well integrated East Coast culture to a very segregated white and Asian with Mexicans somewhere on the side garage door opener culture that was organized entirely differently and made no sense to me. It was totally alienating to me. So I think that was a massively defining factor for my development. And that was what was really lit up in the questions that you asked in preparation for this. It was just that how that echoed forward into my life of becoming someone who knew how to just pull back and observe both from the inside and then also observe outside and look at how conditions greater than myself were defining my life. Yeah.
What particularly interests me, because I think you have a unique capacity to be very much on the inside of things, right? I mean, when you work as a coach and even more so as a spiritual teacher or mentor, but it seems that already very early in your biography, the circumstances needed you to, like, I would not say dissociate, but certainly to abstract from them, enable to, you know, to make sense of them. I wonder when we look a little bit further down the road in your biography, where did this sense of spirituality, life force, and you almost wanting to become a conduit for that showed up for the first time?
I started locking myself in the wrestling room of my high school, which was where we danced. We didn't have a dance room, but we danced in the wrestling room. I started locking myself in the wrestling room of my high school at age 13 and making dances about my emotions and nature and why people get along and why they don't, and spiritual states with no name or form. I didn't want to name them. I actually just wanted to be with them as aesthetic experiences from the age of 13. And I started grabbing other kids and saying, like, let's do these experiments and see what happens. I hadn't, at that point, wasn't exposed to contact improvisation as a concept until I was 18, but I was doing a lot of the same experiments that Nancy Stark Smith and Steve Paxton did when they invented contact improv, of like, what happens if we smash into each other? What happens if we climb into each other? What happens if we share this center where it's shared power? And I was exploring those same experiments and building dances off of them. They gave me an award of best choreographer from my sophomore year in high school every year, because I was like generating like 15 dances a quarter. I was just generating these explorations and working in this spectrum from like very energetic, which I later learned, and sensual, like Dionysian inquiries, to these very like refined aesthetic Apollonian kind of like, what happens if I just explore this line and like shape my body according to the line, kind of like inquiries. So that's when that started. I mean, and I think for me it was a refuge where I could in hindsight, I've looked at it as a shamanic initiation. It was a place where I could come into the energies of my emotions in a way that honored the emotions, but also, and moved them, and also made a deeper sense of them that was beautiful and had motion and had noetic integrity, even if it didn't need a story around it. So that was the opening for me. And then at my last year in high school, I managed to get myself into a college course on Eastern spirituality. And that was kind of like, oh, okay, now things make sense. Because I'd always had this internal story prior to that of like, I was supposed to be a minister, but I'm raised in the wrong time, like, because Christianity has never made sense to me. I was raised by parents who left Christianity, and like intuitively, like Christ on the cross, like sin has never made sense to me. So as a framework for understanding morality. So I was a very moral kid, but I was like, this doesn't make sense to me. And so then I found Eastern spirituality and things started making sense to me. And that was where I got like first contacted the word spiritual and like understood different frames of Sangha and coming together as a group of people who are studying and who are working on consciousness together, as opposed to getting prayer books and sitting in pews. And that never made sense to me. So that was when I was 17, and everything kind of unfolded from there in a lot of ways. And I didn't view myself in any way as a spiritual teacher. I started teaching yoga when I was 27. And I think a lot of people, I don't know, I think it's very hip to consider oneself a spiritual teacher now, but it's still something that I only very delicately step into. It's like, but for years it was like, yes, I teach yoga. Am I a spiritual teacher? I don't know that I'm a spiritual teacher. I'm conveying experiences and information that has been very useful to me on my path. But please don't put that label on me, because I'm not yet quite sure what it constitutes to be worthy of it. And I'm not sure it's useful. Like, it's always felt like a pedestal. And I don't believe in pedestals. I believe in pedagogies of equality. So that's an interesting inquiry.
Isn't it interesting that we both share the commonality of both dancing and expression, as well as this felt sense of wanting to become a minister, you know, just in the wrong time. I mean, I even served in Catholic Church for 6 years, even though I was raised completely agnostic. After this, like, first recognition in college and you teaching yoga, what were other defining moments that shaped your career when we look especially how that unfolded into, like, let's say, the teaching that you're now embodying, which is kind of a very unique synthesis. I mean, we hear a lot of people, you know, telling about synthesis, but I sense in our encounter that you have been really diving very deep from Eastern spirituality into shamanism, the embodied piece, and also psychedelics. So I still have the feeling it makes sense to continue that conversation on the biographical level before then we unpack more the teaching bit of it.
Yeah, I think it's worth reaching back and like grabbing one more thread from earlier in my life, which was nature connection, and consistently actually lied to my mom consistently as a teenager and drove my car not to my best friend's house, but out to be by myself in wild nature. And later, not much later, picked up permaculture as a thread. That for me, even though permaculture, classical permaculture really claims itself as a secular practice, it was always a religious practice for me. It was always a pattern language to describe what I experienced as sacred in nature. So that also was a defining thread. And the reason why I bring that is because from very early, I left college and went to San Francisco to become an artist. And that was very controversial in my world because I was supposed to be a doctor or a lawyer. And it was clear to me that community-based art processes were a way of engaging restorative process and supporting people to really know themselves and heal and co-create and bring meaning, beauty, connection, political empowerment into life. And that time of my life was this kind of like braided strand of art making and permaculture. And there wasn't, again, then there wasn't a word for social permaculture. Social permaculture didn't like emerge as a concept until the 2000s. So that was like, but that's what I was doing. I was doing social permaculture. I was in the same communities as Star Hawk and those kinds of communities, co-founded a 7,000 square foot warehouse art and community space in San Francisco that went for 25 years. And that was very defining, you know, and it was also defining the other thing that was defining about that was the fallout of big community work in a kind of underground or way where you're working so hard to serve community and you're always economically underserved and often underserved in your health and underserved in all kinds of ways. So, you know, I think that was very defining in a lot of ways of of how I understand the world we live in structurally, and a tension in my life around having a really high value for community, and then also being really exquisitely attuned to the fallout of communal processes, because I was very tuned into that from a very early age. Like the more people you have involved, the more challenging it can be to actually generate cohesion. So that shows up as a strong attunement in my work, as well as I suppose an architecture of wounding that has needed a lot of healing over the years. And then a little bit later, I think one of the most defining experiences in my life was an ex-lover who was a master yogi having a violent psychotic break. So at 30, I was holding space for this person who was one of the great loves of my life, who was at that point an ex-lover, who managed to meditate himself out of his body and have a violent psychotic break. And I could go on about the story of that. It's kind of a long story, but it was a terrifying and violent time that also took me very much to the edge of my own sense of sanity, and like left me heartbroken and destroyed a whole yogic community in the process. Everyone disagreed about what was the best thing to do with him. And I didn't get a lot of support in that process. What came to me was that I was supposed to be his primary caretaker, which no one can do alone. And that experience set me on a track of integration. Like for me, it revealed the shortcomings of particularly classic yogic frameworks for enlightenment as a path of wholeness, which was already clear to me, but it shoved it in my face that states like that the traits of transcendence of identity are irrelevant if we're not also integrating the fullness of our human psychosocial, developmental, social, in this life capacities. And so that was very much like the core defining experience of my life that put me on this path of both what does it take for an individual to become a fully integrated human being, and as we, this was 2000, so this was some time ago, but since then I've been on this path of a radical critique of enlightenment as a framework for evolution of humans at scale in a social context, and a radical inquiry of how do we constantly integrate. Like you talk about shadow work. I don't usually talk about shadow work as much. Those aren't the terms I use as much, but they're perfectly valid terms to say there's a lot of content that we need to integrate in order to be full human beings. And one of the kind of koans that I live by is that incarnation is non-accidental and non-arbitrary. In other words, like that experience kind of like slapped me into this perspective where if I was a soul choosing to incarnate as a human, I wouldn't be choosing to come here to attempt to leave here. I would come here with an attempt to like rock this life, to do the life thing on planet Earth really masterfully. And that's kind of the vantage point that has given me, that has really defined both how I work with individuals and how I work with collective processes. That the perspective I come from is we don't choose human incarnation on planet Earth in order to somehow dissociate from it or like become so enlightened that we are no longer at effect of anything that occurs here. We came here to be in the soup of choice, change, and causality, co-evolving something far greater than ourselves, and interacting and being in relationship. And so that's the most defining experience of my development that's relevant to like so many things systemically and mimetically in terms of where we are right now culturally.
I mean, I could not agree more, and actually find it very beautiful that we're not using the same words, because that makes our encounter and also this dialogue much more an inquiry. I know we're both familiar with the integral framework, so I don't want to pour the baby out with the bathwater. I just want to highlight from my side a couple of traits that I see happening. One of which is quick fixes, right? So in the spiritual market, usually you have people advertising for quick fixes. I personally don't believe in quick fixes. Some things can be fixed like maybe rapidly through a strong intention, like going from addiction to sobriety. But then nevertheless, I have the felt experience in my own biography. It takes really years to unlearn patterns and, establish a new equilibrium. Another one is we see a lot of people out there that I would coin from the outside after 25 years on the path myself as more still being an adept, but they're showing up on stage, they're doing good marketing. So it's not necessarily those who have the biggest Instagram followers or show up on, let's say, the big platforms that I deem necessarily those who have like the deepest teaching. So I wonder, from you working in that space now for a couple of decades, I don't know, let's make it 2 or 2.5, right? Which is like a quarter of a century, making this embodied experience. What were a couple of defining moments, maybe also pitfalls in your own teaching that made you really wrestle with like, okay, what is it actually about? How do we need to complement tools and perspectives and maybe also cultures and tradition to provide a framework that's like rich enough, adaptable enough, and customizable to the very needs of every individual or group setting?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I've facilitated in so many different contexts. I think one of the core tensions, I think a lot about facilitation, like you have a bunch of pedals, like sitting at an organ where there's a whole bunch of different pedals. And, you know, and sometimes you can think of one as a go and one as a break, but there's more than one, there's more than two pedals. And one of the major tensions, I think, in all facilitation is between defining and listening, you know, or between didactics and experience, between what it is. Like, I'm a very strong theoretical mind, so I can offer frameworks that are extremely strong. But then on the other hand, I'm very passionate and nurturing is people's self-actualized, self-authoring capacity to come up with their own frameworks in their own language for what they're experiencing. And so, I mean, I would say that over the years, there's been multiple times where I have seen, or an elder has seen in me, the tendency to define, like over-define the space. And like fill it with my own knowledge, as opposed to hold space for the emergence of another person's awareness or self-knowledge or self-definition. That's a primary one that has been honed in me over the entire time that I've been working with people, and has shown up as like one of my own shadows. Like I love to know. And I think that is one of the massive shadows, both on behalf of the teachers and on behalf of students. That the desire to know is a shadow entity, you could say, both on behalf of the ones who show up as teachers, who have all the answers and the bullet points and the easy this or the step-by-step this. It's also a shadow on behalf of the learner, who wants the easy to follow framework. And I watch this over and over again, like with my coaching clients who are kind of like more advanced students. And sometimes I find that I often need to do a lot of work to break a frame, because it's become really rigid. It's like it's nurtured them up to this point, and I can see often so clearly how it will in no way help them to get to the next stage. So there's a need to break the programming of even the spiritual framework. It's very common with people who come through AA, for example, which is an amazing template for a stage of transformation, but can't get people to a higher integral state at all. So like they will be stuck, cut off at the knees in terms of higher integral capacity if they're connected to that framework as their primary framework, for example. So that's one piece that I've seen as my own shortcoming, and I've seen it as a shortcoming in the space. Related to that in myself and in the space is how much something is embodied versus how much something is understood, is known, right? And that toggle between taking the time, the space to integrate something into a felt experience and a constellation of behaviors and habits, where it's like the narrative architecture is actually, it's like the thread that stitches them together, but it's not this noun, like this object in your space that actually isn't backed up by a collection of verbs that are evidencing the story, right? It's like, that's one way I think about that the embodiment is verb based and the knowing is noun based. And what we're really going for is being the shape, like the verbing of what it is to embody the thing. That's shown up for myself, and actually been a very, very long-term set of commitments. I'm actually much more a mental type than I am an embodied type, but I chose dance, and then I chose somatics, and I chose all these embodied processes that, in a sense, is an anecdote for my own tendencies. And then that's what I teach.
I wonder if now is a good time in our meeting to unpack, you know, some of your magic wands and bewitchery. And I especially wonder, without using integral terminology, if you could frame them, you know, from ascension to, from my side, I would say shadow work, to the embodiment piece, to peak experience, to maybe also the psychedelic piece. And before we dive too deep into each of everyone, because I reckon I will have a couple of questions, yeah, what is your menu, so to say, when people work with you, be it one-on-one or in a group setting?
Oh, two very different questions, but I mean, one-on-one, at the core of my work one-on-one with people is an invitation to liberate the person's soul gifts. I mean, that's such a simple kind of thing to say, right? But to unpack what a person really wants, and who, and while holding space for who they're becoming, like who they don't yet know themselves to be. And in my coaching work, I work from, the attraction field that I hold, the invitation that I hold, is that I work from an assumption that we are all here as part of a soul ecology, within which each one of us has a unique role to play, to sing a greater song on behalf of all of life. And so with my individual clients, I mean, my toolbox includes transpersonal psychology, integral psychology. I'm an ordained priestess. I work with embodied and somatic tools. I sit behind my clients' sense making a lot. Because, as I said earlier, like those toggle switches of where is it relevant what I know and where is it relevant what they know. And I also walk side by side with people in a journey that I think is innately spiritual. I think the journey of finding your full empowerment and satisfaction in your work, in your dharma, is innately spiritual. Finding your full satisfaction and coherent attachment and freedom in your relationships is innately spiritual. Evolving the value propositions of massive organizations towards regenerative circularity, regenerative frameworks, circularity frameworks that engage social justice at scale, is innately spiritual. So with my clients, I tend to draw people into greater systems awareness of how their leadership is nurturing a more coherent world, and the way that those external processes are also bound up in their own energy field and their own evolution. And so the work tends to go back and forth between very deeply personal work around core trauma, fear, anxiety, dreams, and very core relationships, into how does that then mirror into choices that are being made in organizations and new initiatives that are birthing. And I spend a lot of time bridging that with people in a way that's nurturing an emergent, regenerative world. that starts from the inside out. It's reflected back to me constantly that I'm one of the few people that can hold space for that very intimate and psycho-emotional and embodied process, and then also bridge to systems knowledge and vision and processes very fluidly and help educate people there. So I go back and forth between being like a priestess holding space to being an educator, whether that's an educator like a spiritual educator or like an educator like a systems educator. And those are ways that I work. When I work with groups, my primary work with groups is in ceremonial space. And ceremonial space for me is about the architecture of attention. And people say a lot, it's about the architecture of intention, but more primarily, I think and fundamentally, it's about the architecture of attention. And so I could get into all the different aspects of that. It's like you're building a collective process where we're nurturing the potential for healing, for world shifting, for harmonization. So much of what ceremony is, it's about harmonizing self, other, and world. And the definition of ceremony I hold is that it's not actually a ceremony unless it is simultaneously nurturing the health, healing, and well-being of the people involved and the world that ceremony, that set of choreography of experiences is nested inside of. So if it's not also simultaneously harmonizing the world that it's inside of, it's not a ceremony. It might be a wonderful healing experience for the people involved, but or perceived to be a wonderful healing experience for the people involved, but it might have dissociative, narcissistic, kind of sociopathic tendencies that don't actually really connect us to cohering in the world that we occupy.
I wonder if you, for those listeners, because to my own knowledge, it's for the first time in my series of podcasts that I'm speaking with someone that's very deeply into ceremonial work. And I wonder if you could sketch a couple of examples of ceremonies and maybe tie it together with one of my core questions here today with you is, you mentioned the word soul a couple of times. And in as much as I understand it, you use that word almost as a counterpoint towards the ascension piece, which basically means, when we look back in the history of spirituality, a lot of it is away from, let's say, us being incarnated. Let's say classical Mahayana Buddhism, you get enlightened, then, you escape the wheel of reincarnation. Then Mahayana Buddhism basically saying, okay, that's not really the answer. We're choosing to stay here despite me basically renouncing on the ultimate liberation. Also, when I look at like more Western approaches, like you leave the world, you go into a monastery, you become a monk or a nun. The more modern version that I see is like people are afloat, right? Everything, they're super successful. They make, ideally, obviously, a lot of money, but they seem like very afloat. Many of them I don't perceive as if they still did really care about the poor, the disenfranchised, climate change. And then maybe as a last point in your direction, especially in Advaita Vedanta circles, I have this feeling like right and wrong doesn't matter, the person abused, attracts the person that's, abusing him or her. So it all gets super mushy. So I know this is not, it's more like something that I want to put into the middle of the room for us to jointly unpack. Because one of the thing that fascinates me about you so much is that you hold this very high degree of complexity cognitively, and you know the frameworks, but at the same time, you're working really very deep. So, I mean, this was a couple of questions out there, so happy to simply listen.
Can I swear on your podcast?
Sure, please.
Okay, fuck ascension. Just fuck ascension. Like, I feel so much rage at the level of dissociation, sloppy thinking, moral relativism, and privilege that is protected in the frame of ascension. It is not okay. You know, like, if that is spiritual, then fuck spirituality. Frankly, you know, it's like, and I watch how it's almost entirely white people who run that narrative. If they're not white, they're economically privileged. If they're not economically privileged, then it's like a refuge where they've gotten away. Like, I meet beautifully evolved, but also not integrated African-American people who hold the ascension narrative. But I watch how that's a refuge from the epigenetic trauma that isn't integrated. And I mean, back to the Bodhisattva vow, I've definitely taken that vow for multiple lifetimes. And back to indigenous roots that we all have, you know, I think that the ascension narrative is a very convenient way to run from our ancestry and run from the mess that we created here on this planet. And certainly, yes, in the greatest expansion of non-dual consciousness, it is all one. And we could reach to go back to that, to dissolve the specificity of ensoulment back into the pool, the oceanic pool of consciousness. I understand that vision of the arc of consciousness. I've played it out in my own spiritual practice over 50 years. It's a beautiful refuge and it's relieving. But back to the incarnation is non-accidental and non-arbitrary. And then to point to what all of those narratives miss is that life on this planet is a miracle. It is a miracle of unknowable, incalculable proportions. To be alive in a place with the level of biodiversity and manifest intelligence that this particular Gaian project. You know, and there are Gaias all over the universe. There are planets that have hit the lottery of receiving water onto their bodies and booting up life that had enough of a Goldilocks opportunity to manifest the level of intelligent complexity that we are living in right here. So to me, most ascension narratives, not all, most ascension narratives provide an excuse to dissociate from the way that God is already happening right here, and from the opportunity that is present in terms of humans collaborating with the level of intelligence and biodiversity and majesty and abundance and wealth that we are actually a part of, and wealth in terms of consciousness. It is miserly in the most extreme way. It's not okay. You know, but what interests, one possible definition of ascension that does interest me is to turn towards a co-evolution of the planetary project with humans as a conscious creator species, collaborating in the physical and in the subtle ecology of consciousness to raise all boats, not just the human boats, and certainly all human boats of all colors in all bodies, and all boats, you know, all bodies, all birds and trees and microorganisms into the next stage of the harmonic of what this planet can become. Now, that is an interesting definition of ascension to me, and it can be mapped in terms of frequency, right? Because that's all relationships that have frequency, that have either disharmony or harmony, that have intelligent conflict or you know, life degenerating conflict involved in them, right? That's a definition of ascension that I could get on board with. But I think the word ascension is kind of confusing at this point, so I'd just like to trash it. I'd rather just say fuck ascension, and let's do a project of planetary regenesis, of planetary coevolution. That interests me greatly, you know. And when I say soul, just to answer that question, when I say soul, I mean the unique suchness that makes each thing itself. And in that sense, you know, everything has soul to greater or lesser degrees. But you know, one tree is not the same as another tree. You are not the same as I am. Soul is that which makes each thing itself. And you could say that spirit is that which is the same for all things. We could get into very specific definitions there. We don't need to go there. But in soul, everything is differentiated. And what I'm shown over and over again is that that's God's favorite project. So why would we try to return to undifferentiatedness if we're actually doing the thing that is most elevating of divine intelligence? You know, to exalt in the specificity that we are, and then elevate the integrity and beauty and coherence of other specificities is the greatest game we could possibly play. And there's a whole philosophic and like kind of metaphysical and ontological conversation to have there, that up until this phase in human civilization, we've mastered subjectivity. Like I can become the Buddha, I can be God. We've mastered objectivity. We can measure and collaborate with anything as a dead matter, you know, but we haven't mastered intersubjectivity and interobjectivity. And that's what I'm talking about. And like, yes, if that was measured on a frequency level, sure, we could call it ascension. But it is absolutely a process that's a material process and a relational process. So
what I mean, I don't know if I would call it epiphany, because I usually, in my life, I think up until this conversation, I never or hardly ever used the word soul. But if you say spirit is suchness, void, life force, you know, the creator, undifferentiated, running through all of manifestation, and then manifesting as 3D reality onto this planet, with each having a unique and distinct embodied lived experience, then I really think I can use the word soul from now on. I wonder, in our conversation,
just as a side note, you just use the shorthand that I give people without me giving it to you. It's the one, the all, and the each.
Again.
The one, the totality of all consciousness or all information, the subjective totality of existence of all the metaverses. The all, which is taking it all as a detailed fabric, as opposed to a total fabric, a singular fabric. The all, and there's the each. You just use those exact words. That was really beautiful. And in that shorthand, you can like feel your eachness, your one, your suchness, and sit like this. That opens the gates of appreciation, which is the first code of attention that opens that starts to expand the sacredness, expand the energy of shared collaboration, shared co-creation.
Let's see if I can evoke some more swear words on my podcast. So, and I need to frame this question properly. So I did 15 years of meditative and contemplative practice, plus some 7 years of psychotherapy before I did my first psychedelic experience. And in the last 11 years, I did a lot of them. So I again see traits in the market, one of which would be go to ceremony and then everything is solved. So people are focusing way too little on the integration piece. Another piece is abusing the sacraments of sacred medicine, be they really plant medicine or psychedelic, let's say chemical compounds such as MDMA or LSD, but they're abusing them in the sense of, instead of integrating, they need to do them so often, but they don't have the practice to manifest these beautiful states in everyday life. And finally, and that's actually one of the biggest pieces that I'm wrestling with, so I'm super curious on Burning Man, precisely with that lens on. This, I will also enjoy it, but it's mainly because I want to have a lived experience of so many powerful, wealthy, incredibly privileged people that seemingly, I can only assume from my own psychedelic experiences, have had oneness, Godhead, liberation, like everything. So they have based in the whatever mana of all these amazing experiences that up until very shortly were only able, were only available for a very tiny fraction of humanity. In my personal numbers, when I do the math of, when the people look in how many people are using the substances, I really think it's like whatever 100 million people each year or so. So we're talking about vast numbers. So I wonder, since you hold ceremonial space, also using plant medicine, and you being very critical of the space, and again, maybe I can evoke some swear words, where do you see the whole endeavor? How is it possible that so many people are using them and seemingly either just scratching the surface, right? But not really doing the deep work that, to my humble own lived experience, is time and again tough work, right? It needs like months and years of dedication to work through these like deep layers of social upbringing, ancestral trauma, personal trauma, collective trauma. Yeah. So anyhow, again, this was less like one question in your direction, but again, more like a couple of possibilities where you can riff off.
Yeah, God, there's so much there. I don't know if you'll get swear words out of me. You might. What's been alive for me lately is that you can't scale cultural contexts that no longer exist without great patience. So I think above all, the key word that wasn't said is preparation. Like you gave the context, you said, I did all of these things before going to plant medicine. The word that we don't have currently in the cultural discourse, there's a big focus right now on critiquing that we don't do integration. I would say the more important critique is that we don't do preparation. And that if we just starting to focus on that would be helpful. Just that would be helpful. I see also with clients and in the space that the more preparation people do, the more integration happens naturally. That there's a very direct relationship between effective integration and significant preparation, and that interestingly, integration tends to take care of itself when people are really well prepared. Like there's so much, I put a lot more emphasis on the front end than the back end, because if the front end is really well attended, the back end tends to be better structured and more intuitive and easier to integrate in terms of our narrative architectures about our experience. That to me is just one of the obvious keys. But I think there's so many challenges. Like,
let's just interrupt you here, because again, epiphany, right? I've never in my life reflected this. So since I'm not so much a writing guy, how is it even possible that there is, at least, I mean, how is it possible that I never stumbled over preparing, for psychedelic experiences? Because I certainly know in a monastic context, obviously, before you go on a session, you need to do your prep work, and with basically everything that we learn also in school, or when we learn, I don't know, to become a chef, you first need to start peeling and chopping veggies. So how do you explain this lack of a focus on preparation?
There's a lot of reasons why. I mean, some of it is just market dynamics, but I would say in the underground, it's because of, a lot of the traditional indigenous healers who come are hosted by people. They come from far away. They're coming from out of cultural context. They may or may not have stable preparatory practices in their home places. The culture itself often had served as the preparatory context. So there's in that kind of indigenous traditional framework, there's a problem of context, and that is both broad in terms of cultural context, and then specific in terms of the dynamics of bringing people to visit from other places. I have a few peers and people I know in the space who have really beautiful preparatory practices that they have people do prior to coming to an ayahuasca ceremony, or prior to coming to a wachuma ceremony. You have to go to a pipe ceremony, which is a traditional way of anchoring into prayer. It's a really complex question, because also preparation is a cultural construct, right? So what preparation looks like in a psychotherapeutic context is very different than what it looks like in a ceremonial context. Ceremonial contexts often bridge to the psychotherapeutic, but they're not framed that way. Some people are resistant to those kinds of more religious ceremonial frames. I actually find that those more religious or ritualized ceremonial frames are often a lot more effective as preparatory frames for ceremonial experience. And just to be clear, I can't speak with great authority on psychotherapeutic context. That's not the context I work in. I have a master's degree in wisdom studies. So essentially I have a master's degree in being a priestess with an integral psychological and trauma-based framework attached to it. So in this space, I have also kind of like unique qualifications in that I have been facilitating altered states transformation for 30 years. I have studied with many indigenous lineages, and I have a degree that doesn't fit into any of the boxes to get certified as a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist, which has a certain advantage, because I actually don't think that psychotherapeutic training as a gate to facilitate psychedelics is I think it's one of the ways that some people can become qualified to do it, but it's very insufficient as a gate. And even keeping gates in a institutionalized Western way is really problematic in terms of what it takes to be a qualified human to actually hold these kinds of spaces. Like we're in really big problems of gateways right now. and of cultural context and construct that are huge. You know, it's like we've got a lot of kind of self-ordained shamans coming up in the world who may or may not have years of spiritual practice behind them, may or may not have any real depth or mentoring in facilitating group spaces, may or may not have indigenous elders who bless them, may or may not have enough depth of psychotherapeutic wisdom around parts work, around trauma, around a really coherent understanding of what healthy human attachment is. You know, like I think without those things, we end up in a very messy place very quickly.
I think we really are in a messy place, and let's leave out the everything is kind of messy, like
yeah,
but let's stay with the messiness of the psychedelic, like the third wave, you know, that we're in the middle of. And so people pop pills, they have all sorts of experiences, even those that seemingly, you know, with the best of their possibilities and to their knowledge and you know, drop into ceremonial contexts. It's just that I'm seeing it, I mean, mainly in Berlin, so I might be biased, but I reckon it's pretty much the same in the United States, is I see too little frame. I've not thought so much about the preparation, but definitely about the integration. So I wonder if it makes sense to dive into different ceremonial contexts or also cultures that you have been immersed in, to then try and sketch what is a good preparation, what does a good integration look like, and what ultimately people need, so that these holy sacraments can really be the transformational catalyst that so many wish.
yeah. I mean, I don't know that it makes sense to get into other traditions because that doesn't necessarily meet listeners in context. I mean, I could brushstroke a few, like there's a wonderful tradition where you do a spirit arrow and you really consider what you're contributing with, like, and all the feathers that you put on that arrow are contributing to the energies, and then you make the arrow and you're shooting an arrow of intent. There's traditions where the church that I come from, you have to come to at least one pipe ceremony before you come to a San Pedro medicine ceremony. And in that pipe ceremony, you are going to learn and then do the prayer format that you bring into ceremony. And it's a very simple way of praying. It's basically like, this is what I'm grateful for. This is what I'm struggling with. This is what I need help with. And so it's a practice of voicing, you know, your prayer, and that you get used to, and you kind of like drop into, oh, this is what's actually going on for me. I think to give broad brushstrokes, I also just want to shout out, prior to even continuing this very critical conversation, I want to shout out all the people who are doing incredible work to create safe and coherent contexts, both in the underground and in the psychotherapeutic space. Like, there are tens and tens and tens of thousands of people who are working so hard to create safe and sane and sometimes sacred spaces to do the work, to support people. And additionally, I would say that part of the chaos that's coming up is people really are in crisis. And so it's important to acknowledge that, because when you're really in crisis, it's a very hard time to pause and say, oh, I got to get prepared. You know, like, there is a genuine impulse of like, I am so messed up and confused and scared, or just can't even sit in my body, that I need to do something. And that is a real experience for millions and millions of people. So it's really important to acknowledge that, and not make people wrong for wanting help, right?
I mean, that's pretty much the opposite of what I wanted to do. I want to bring more the...
Oh, I wasn't saying that was what you were trying to do. I just wanted to like frame that as the bigger frame.
I want to
and
bring
then
more
say,
like discernment into such a
yes,
complex, messy field, you know? So let's
yes.
circle around discernment.
Well, and I think if we just pause again on preparation and like really simple journal questions, like, okay, so you're thinking about doing this. What are you grateful for? What are you struggling with? What kind of help are you looking for? And I really want to pause on the help. Like in a lot of indigenous traditional contexts for working with psychedelics, we talk about the help. You're coming for the help. What is helping you? You are helping you. The psychedelic is helping you. All of your ancestors, guides, guardians are helping you. If you're open to a concept of universe, source, higher love, that which harmonizes, that is helping you. And additionally, like whoever is supporting you, and that's a very important thing, is the aspect of other humans and training with you and attuning with you and supporting you. Who is helping you? What's the help? And then if there's something you want, you know, do you want to get clarity in your work? You know, people come a lot and they'll just say, I want whatever the medicine is offering me, or I want guidance, or but it's like, no, get details. Like, I want to know, I want to get clear with what choice to make about my career. I want to be able to feel my center in regards to this relationship and choose whether or not to be in it or not. You know, I think one of the ways people fail to prepare and then drastically sabotage themselves is by being very general and very sloppy in intentions.
So sharpening the intention.
And being vulnerable about it, right? Like just saying I want guidance is also an excuse for not being, it's a really easy way to not be vulnerable. And then you kind of are zooming through a zone in consciousness that's like very vanilla. It's very like, yes, maybe I'll get light and flowers, maybe I'll go into a dark hole, maybe it'll be interesting, but it's not like I want to move forward in my life. Like one of the characteristics, this is another helpful piece, is a significant distinction between a lot of psychotherapeutic models and shamanic models. Is psychotherapeutic models tend to be about process, and shamanic models and coaching models, interestingly, tend to be about moving forward. And that's extremely characteristic in medicine work and ceremonies generally in indigenous healing traditions. Ceremonies might be about tending a moment. They might be about tending a death or attending to an opening astrologically that has great importance, or attending to, but healing processes are always about, the point is to move forward effectively, not dissociatively, like now everything's light and flowers, but effectively, like I can do my relationships, I can sleep, I can manage my eating habits, I can make better choices in whatever domain I'm in, I can trust my choices in whatever domain I'm in, I can move from great self-doubt to self-trust. That's forward. And it is characteristic of all indigenous traditions that unless you have a clear intention to move forward, you are not honoring the medicine. So that would be like one of the pillars of reverence, or one of the pillars of true respect or reciprocity for the gift that you're receiving in the medicine itself. And I think there's a lot of things at that gate, like we take, again, privilege plays out in how we receive medicine. Like, oh, I just got this pill, or my friend just gave it to me, or someone said I should do this, as opposed to, I asked for this. I'm going to receive it with gratitude. I'm going to thank the universe, my friend, this teacher, the plant, the earth, for offering this to me. I'm going to dignify this sacrament by making a clear prayer for my life, you know, by being clear about my intention and being committed to moving forward. That's how you keep the practice grounded. You know, it's interesting because if I keep making this gesture of forward, you know, and the contrast would be, like, I just want something, you know, it's kind of like this open-ended, non-directional, I'm just going to get more experiences kind of energy. And that isn't, it's not a devotional energy. It's not an energy that honors the gift and carries the gift forward. I mean, and in this sense, there's some very simple frames that are cultural frames on right use that do require preparation. Your preparation is about clear intent. It's about another aspect of preparation is knowing where whatever you're taking comes from, even if it's synthetic. Like knowing the chain of who made it and was it made with good energy, good intent. And if you don't know that being willing to say no to it. You know, if you're working with plants, knowing where they came from, who grew them, who prepared them, were they paid for with real reciprocity. That's critical.
That's a good segue to a question that, to be very honest, even me in the context of making my experiences, because I never changed my shaman. She's a woman living in Berlin and she's preparing ayahuasca herself, but with the mimosa plant, so not with the vine. And only, I think, maybe 5 years ago, I became aware that really some of these sacred plants, especially, you know, around ayahuasca, but also around peyote, are really in danger of extinction. So I wonder, I mean, you already, you know, explained a little bit, you know, how are you dealing with that, and how do you see the context in that evolving? Because much like you also mentioned a couple of times, they're really simply market mechanisms, you know, at play. So the likelihood that in the next years the numbers of people sitting in ceremony will quadruple or 10x, you know, is just very likely. So how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, this is all in the category of preparation, which is interesting, right? Like preparing for psychedelic use or ceremony in common North American language would be in a good way. We say in a good way, but another way to say that would be preparing in a way that is good for you and good for the world, or preparing in a way that is reverent and ethical. To actually ground in reverence and ethical use is a form of preparation. It might require some research that has nothing to do with your own need to go to ceremony. Can I trust this person who's facilitating and or who's giving me or selling me the medicine? Do they know where it came from? Did, you know, going back through the chain of supply in a way that is that guarantees that whatever you are receiving has come to you in a way that is reciprocal with the earth, with indigenous people, and with the plants, energetically, ecologically, and financially. That is a form of preparation. To say no to a ceremony because you actually don't know that things are trustworthy is a profound ceremony. And that's a gate of initiation. So I think like one of the pieces of education, so as a facilitator, I always know where things come from. I let people know, I model that. And then I say, this is what I would like for you to always require of your shaman, of your facilitator, and of the medicine that comes into your space. Like always ask where it came from. Always be clear with that. Be willing to pay for it if it costs more money. Be willing to support initiatives. There's a wonderful initiative that a friend of mine, Laura Dawn, just helped to create with many stakeholders called Grow Medicine, that allows for reciprocity going back to indigenous stewards for the medicine. That to me is an aspect of preparation, again, where we're going into to give the definition of ceremony again, ceremony isn't a ceremony unless it's good for the people in it and the world it is nested inside of. That starts with how you source medicine and how you source context, because we're often sourcing context from indigenous teachers, indigenous traditions. Are we doing that with naming? Are we naming our teachers, or are we in appropriation? Are we also working to source from our own indigenous lineages, which if you're in a white body are often nearly dead lineages, but that's also a real humming thread that you can tap into as you continue the path. We all come from indigenous ancestors. But to do that with deep respect for the context that is largely being set by people of color, indigenous people of color, who are recent recipients of genocide and great cultural appropriation. So how do you hold that? How do you also be in a place that is emergent and creative simultaneously? But that begins with the contemplation on the chain of connections. That is a creative act in terms of generating actual reverence that is evolutionary, that is present tense in the ecosystem, in a planetary ecosystem that's evolving really rapidly. But I think an aspect, it's interesting, I'm kind of obsessing about this right now because I'm having it as an idea that an aspect of preparation at scale is educating people about knowing where their sources of medicine are and approaching that with reverence. Like that, if that came out as a commitment within the marketplace, in the marketplace of consumers, that becomes a force for a cleaner reciprocal loop. And I believe this isn't something that's documented, but I very much believe that the quality of journey you have is also energetically informed by the sourcing of the medicine in a significant way. But being conscious of that is a practice of reverence, a practice of reciprocity. Then again, like answering your really clear questions for yourself. What am I grateful for? What am I struggling with? What do I actually need help with? And what do I hope to, move forward in my life? That's really clean preparation. And that's what I do in preparation work with people. And it can take a while to figure that out. But having figured that out, what I've seen with incredible consistency is even if the journey doesn't in any way directly reflect on what the preparation was, the integration always does. With incredible consistency. I think there's ways we could deal with the kind of chaos that we're in that would be problematic. Like I'm a advocate for very, very slow legalization. I think decriminalization is actually the most interesting horizon to me, because I feel strongly that even though we're in a chaotic situation, solutions need to come from communities, that we're not in a place where the people who would be legislating, who would be regulating, have sufficient intelligence about the nature of this emergence and the nature of the medicines, or the nature of the sacred that we are navigating to regulate it. So I'm a huge advocate for community-based solutions. I'm a huge advocate for decriminalization, including the chaos that it can instigate. But decriminalization can create context to create care that is supported. I mean, Portugal is a great example. There's more examples of that in Europe than there are in the United States, but there's a strong movement around it in the United States as well. I also am a really big advocate for open doors between people doing the work in psychotherapeutic contexts and people doing the work in the underground. And there's actually a pretty big wall between those two worlds at this point. And I think that requires relationship building. Like, I think anyone who does the work should be reaching out to others, should be building bridges, open door bridges where we're learning together, That's a hard sell in a lot of ways. But I think it's a very important part of the process. Additionally, I would say, yeah, if you're not working to become a better human, you're doing you're doing the work wrong. Like, if you're trying to become God or dissolve into the singularity, or like hang out in a place where you're quite sure that it's all a simulation and none of it matters, like, you're doing the work wrong. And that's a very blunt statement. Like, you're not working to be a better human with other humans in the communities that you actually occupy, in the places that you actually live, in the businesses you actually interact with, in the political environments you are actually a part of, you are doing it wrong.
Just good segue. So approaching, the end of our encounter, I wonder, there's like 3 big bullet points in my head still. One is spiritual bypassing, and which I see as the tendency to flee the human messiness by means of spirituality, spiritual materialism. And I understand it, a little bit when you are in a room. Let's say I'm traveling and you're with other people that are in the plant medicine realm, and then suddenly it goes, yeah, I've been to Peru and I've done this, and I've been doing like 50 ceremonies, and the next one has been doing, and I sat with Bufo, kind of this like bragging, with these experiences. And then maybe finally, and I really think that's the trickiest one, spiritual narcissism. So I don't think we need to unpack all of them, but I'm curious at least on a couple of words and your reflections on these topics.
I mean, in a lot of ways, I think we've spoken to. I shared the experience of in my 30th year of this person having a psychotic break. That's the extreme spiritual bypass, right? I think it's what I just said about psychedelic work applies to the spiritual bypass conversation. It's such a blunt statement, and I'm sure it will piss a lot of people off. If you're not trying to become a better human, you're doing it wrong.
I love it. I mean, that's it. This is what the spiritual teacher he gave me when I was 16. He says, I have it on a postcard, one of my oldest ones. He said, all spiritual practice that does not lead into everyday mundane life is a cul-de-sac, like doesn't make like any sense, right?
Yeah. Incarnation is non-accidental and non-arbitrary, therefore live. So it feels really good to solve life by not needing to feel it. It can feel really good, but spiritual bypassing is such an interesting thing, because it is it's like there is a slippery slope. There's a slippery slope of becoming more really masterful at in training consciousness on stillness. And that to me is actually one of the spokes of the wheel. It's or a pillar of an evolutionary spiritual map. It's not to say don't do that, right? But it's then to say, are you then able to be responsive to the needs of others? Are you able to be in life with an open heart? And are you able to be really effective in your creativity and your power? And additionally, are you able to feel all of your feelings in a way that is not stuffed or subtly dissociated? And like, are you able to let the rainbow of the genius thing that is an emotional body express itself. So to me that those two pillars are actually quite hard to hold in the same brain and the same body. And where we are right now in kind of cracking the codes of being human, I think that those two are two to hold as really exquisite dance partners, right? Like you could say truly the Shiva and Shakti within. Like, can we genuinely hold that like cultivate that capacity for still point and presence? And can we genuinely cultivate the capacity to feel all of our feelings and be responsive and connected and intimate, and to experience grief and brokenness and sadness and bliss and all the different juicy textures of appreciation and joy and wonder and vulnerability, and to be in that rainbow, that Shakti totality that my research continues to show me is a way that the soul knows itself and steers itself. The soul doesn't actually steer itself through that still point. The soul steers itself through the way our organism is designed to be responsive in a way that's unhindered. You know, our culture, our identities block that. And then the identity wants to not be chaotic, not be a mess, not be, so then we move over to, okay, I'll go for still point. But I mean, one of the things that specifically in pathogens like San Pedro and MDMA are actually helpful for is to like just liberate the rainbow, liberate the river, so you can hear and feel your soul. So I would say like spiritual bypassing is like the place where our ego gets involved in like a meta ego that's like, well, this is all very messy, so I'll just like make that sub-self really strong and annihilate like the undercurrent that is actually trying to express itself as the rainbow of your soul's intelligence. And I think that's a motivating invitation, right? Where it's like, great, yes, okay, cultivate that pillar and that majesty, but that's not the full intelligence of the soul being expressed, or the full capacity we incarnate with for intimacy with ourselves and others in life, and beauty and pain, and to be imprinted and attuned and informed and inspired and motivated. And that's how love knows itself, and how choice actually ultimately really knows itself through our lives. So that's a little on spiritual bypassing. It's safe, but it's boring, and kind of a dead end for the soul, actually. And I think that that's a bridge to spiritual narcissism, because in some ways, like that kind of map I just drew, it's a very obvious map. It's like really easy to cultivate the sub-self that is perfected. And that's just a much more evolved part, an aspect of the ego that is part of the protector controller that's very good at stuffing the emotions and stuffing often connection to other people, and doing the right thing in terms of a performative spiritual narrative, showing up in a way that is insta-friendly, you know, in all the obvious ways. But or not, you know, it can happen in many different zones of the world. But you know, we live in a little, like the spectrum of healthy narcissism is something we all need. We all need a little bit of healthy self-esteem and healthy self-witness and healthy self-appreciation. But we also live in a very narcissistic, in a techno-cultural context that really amplifies narcissistic tendencies. And I actually think we all need to be a little bit vigilant to that, specifically and first and foremost in ourselves. And I don't think there's a single anecdote to it, but I think becoming wise to it in a way that doesn't then grasp towards call out culture, which just amplifies the whole pattern, but that is actually anchored in curiosity, is a really healthy approach to that. What do you really feel? It's a good question.
So my last question for today is, if we both look into the future, we can't predict the future, but we co-create it from the tiny individual level to the context we're embedded in, through how we unfold our purpose and the ripple effects our work takes, to then the systemic, let's say acupuncture points to really make a difference. If you were to take a positive outlook on us collectively and taking your own work and like this rich tapestry of topics that we have explored today, what gives you hope, and where do you really think that especially integrally informed spirituality, putting discernment in the middle and really looking at the individual level, but also at the group level of what is needed in the specific context so that you can heal, grow up, show up, and really make a difference? What is it that gives you most hope? Just, I want a couple of sentences of this like fire inside of you, the sparkles. And with that, we leave the listeners.
What gives me the most hope is seeing how the attunement, the connection between this idea that I spoke earlier of ascension being an actual physical process. What gives me the most hope is seeing people connect their sense of self evolution with their sense of participating in shifting towards sustainability, regeneration, community nourishment. Like that gives me so much hope when people connect the dots and then become activated in a place of like, here's my own personal healing, my own awakening, my own remembering of how epic and beautiful this gift of life is, and here's how I'm creating change in the world with that. I mean, I'm part of a project called a New Earth Project that I helped to instigate, that is creating firstly sustainability, but then working towards circularity in the entire packaging supply chain. And that project as a microcosm of what will be many multi-stakeholder macrocosms. I mean, it's actually not such a small microcosm. It's involving the biggest surf names in the world and the biggest packaging companies in the world and the biggest consumer brands in the world, and everyone's leaning in. It's involving senators and state governments and like looking at like what's the most transpartisan, cross-partisan political meshwork that we could possibly create that would like dissolve this as a partisan issue. So it's working with a deep red state and a deep blue state in two totally different dimensions in America, but the project is international. And like watching people light up to that and find their stakeholder participation in it, and then watching how that works for an individual who's working inside a company, watching for how that works as, for a president of a company, and watching how it's working in the ecosystem is amazing. To me, what I think is happening for a lot of people, and I've experienced that this is true when I talk to people in different ecosystems, that we're in a sense waking up to a story that we're nested inside of. Like, it's a story that's bigger than the human story. It's a story of planetary evolution and how humans are participating in the next stage of integrity, coherence, beauty, consciousness on the planet as a whole, for all beings on this planet, for all forces of nature on this planet, It's about us harmonizing with biology, harmonizing with ecology, harmonizing with the forces of nature, harmonizing with consciousness, engaging our creative capacity to create circularity that serves the continuity of life, and that it's a story about continuity rather than discontinuity. It's not a hero's journey. It's a journey of heroes who have come home, who are all tending home together. And when I talk with people about it, they have their own narrative about it, and they get it. Like, there's an energy to that. That gives me great hope. You know, and if I haven't yet quite found a way to ignite that intelligence in the tech world, because Asperger brains tend to be very resistant to feeling that story. But that's to me, that's the big play. It's like, really, there's a bigger story going on. We're inside of it. And when you tap into it and find your own part of that symphony, it's really pleasurable. It makes life make sense. Literally, life finally makes sense. The fact of human existence and of having choice and of wanting love and of being loved makes sense. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Oh, Samantha, thanks so much for this precious time together. I think it's really beautiful to end with your sparkly giggles. Thanks for the time together.
Thank you, Alistair. It's such a pleasure.